Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Brynjolfsson, and this is the Digital Economy Lab Lunch Seminar. Today, we're going to have a seminar with Simon Johnson, my old colleague from MIT. He's the Ronald Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship there at the MIT Sloan School, where he heads the Global Economics and Management Group. In 2007 and 8, he was the chief economist at the IMF, and he's currently co-chair of the CFA Institute for Systemic Risk Council. And in February, Simon joined the board of directors of Fannie Mae. You may have seen his recent book with Daron Acemoglu, and his talk is going to be in part based on that, but he tells me he's also going to have bits of his previous book, both of which I think are terrific, and I've been reading and recommending to folks. We welcome and encourage questions. What we'll do is, for the first half hour or so, we'll give him a chance to present his material. If there's a clarifying question, feel free to ask it. And then for the second half hour, we'll have a broader discussion. So please join me in welcoming Simon Johnson.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Eric, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to speak here. This is a real thrill, and I think a huge opportunity for me and for Daron, who unfortunately can't be with us today, because we're interested in the future of technology, and we're particularly interested in productivity and the intersection of that with artificial intelligence. And you, I think, at Stanford are at the epicenter of both what's happening and, of course, how we should think about and how we're trying to think about both what's happening around us and what could happen, and maybe ways in which this could go somewhat better, in ways I'll explain. So let me take, as Eric said, the first half hour and talk about this idea of redirecting technological change. And let me break that into three pieces. The first question is, can we redirect technological change? The second piece is, should we do it? And the third piece is, will we do it? And what would it take, actually? And I think plenty of discussion on that, but also along the way. And as Eric said, if you have clarifying questions in the first half hour, feel free to stop me. Otherwise, we've got a lot of time for Q&A. And I'm not going anywhere else today, so happy to stay on and chat with anyone. So the answer to the first question, can we redirect technological change, I think is actually very straightforward. And this is the time of year I most like to give this talk. It's October 9th. On October 5th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, which was a massive shock to the world and to the American scientific and policy establishment. And of course, a month later, they launched the first animal into space. It was a dog. This particular dog, unfortunately, did not come back alive. And that was known to the American press as Mutnik. So we had Sputnik and then Mutnik. Those are two pivotal events. But the US was ready. The US had been working on a satellite program. The US Navy launched this Vanguard rocket in early December 1957. And as soon as that rocket took off, it exploded. So that became known in the American media as Kaputnik. This confluence of events really crystallized in the American official mind the importance of science, the importance of spending on science, the importance of being strategic about science, which is a lesson they'd also learned in World War II and had applied, obviously, development of radar, the Manhattan Project, other applications. The political consequences of the Sputnik confluence of events were the creation of NASA. It was the National Defense Education Act of 1958, and it was an intensification of federal spending in support of science and technology, including my campus at MIT. This campus, I'm sure, Stanford benefited just as well. That was a completely bipartisan response. I think there was some objections on the left and on the right, but that was a unified American political response. And if you look at that period from, let's say, 1940, before 1940, the US federal government did very little to direct technology and technological change. World War II was about applying existing science to the war effort. After World War II, Vannevar Bush, former dean of engineering at MIT, and his colleagues persuaded American officialdom, after the usual, to and fro in Washington, that spending money on science and technology was a good investment, both for obvious national security purposes, also to strengthen the economy, and to ward off and deal with unforeseen problems that you might encounter. So the good point about the railroads, and as we're on the Leland Stanford Junior campus, we should discuss that, and I will come back to railroads in a few minutes, Eric. So in America, this is, of course, part of the fascinating discussion that you hear around Washington right now, which is, do we have an industrial policy in the United States? Have we had an industrial policy or industrial strategy for a long time? We've certainly had a political system that has favored business and favored the expansion of business opportunities, and railroads would be a leading, shining example of that in the 19th century. So let's circle back to that towards the end, Eric, I think, because it also fits into, I think, what we can imagine in terms of realistic policy, what actually works in the American system, and what are the right lessons to learn from Herbert Hoover's experience as well, right? These are all highly relevant here. So I do not believe that books change history. Absolutely do not. Okay, but I have to say that in 2019, Jon Gruber and I published his book Jumpstarting America, which said that you should spend more on science and technology. This would be good for growth, and this would have big spillover effects. And it lines up very nicely with some of the work of people in this room. In early 2020, I remember vividly having a meeting with a senior Senate staffer who said, "Simon, love the book, great ideas, but let me tell you, this is not going to happen. Right? Not our priority. We don't have the money." That was the last meeting I had before the country shut down for COVID. And the lesson taken from COVID, which we can certainly discuss, was that once again, just like in the 1940s, scientific capacity that we'd built primarily for other purposes could be redeployed at a time of national emergency and used to develop, for example, what I regard, but we can discuss this, as a safe and effective vaccine in very, very quickly. And that lesson has been taken and applied in the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. And I think that is, again, some of you may have objections, I understand, but I think that has a lot of positive spillover effects in the science part of it, certainly. We can discuss the CHIPS part separately. So can we redirect technological change? Yes, absolutely. We've done it before in the United States. We've done it in national emergencies. We've done it as a long-term investment. It pays off, and I think we should do more of it. Now, should we redirect it? I think that's an interesting question. That's the focus of this book with Daron Acemoglu, Power and Progress. And one response that we get, and this I have to say, get from a lot of economists, is, in fact, we even go so far to say this is a view that's so powerful in economics and so widespread, doesn't even have a name. So we gave it a name. We call it the productivity bandwagon, which is, you know what? When you have productivity improve, when technology changes and technology improves, you get productivity increases. And that will naturally raise wages, improve working conditions, and expand opportunities. And everyone will benefit from that process eventually. That's what we call the productivity bandwagon. And that's what we are. And certainly it is the case that the productivity bandwagon sometimes prevails, and we'll talk about when. But the reason we wrote this book, and the reason we went back, the book's called Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity, because we think there is an integrated, pretty strong record of what's happened over the past 1,000 years in the technology and industrial tradition that's built this society and other societies. And you can go back earlier, and we can talk about antecedents as well and other episodes. But our read of the history is there's nothing automatic about the productivity bandwagon, or at least this word eventually. Productivity improves, wages go up, everybody gains eventually. This eventually can be quite a long time. So if you look at, for example, what happened in the Middle Ages, we spent quite a long time with this in the book. Yeah, I understand that people in the Renaissance called them the Dark Ages, but that was slander. It wasn't an appropriate term. There was plenty of innovation, plenty of invention in West European societies in the 1100s, in the 1200s, 1300s, but very few benefits came down to the people working in agriculture. So they invented windmills, they improved water mills, they improved a lot of agricultural techniques. They used a lot more horses in agriculture and in transportation. The standard of living for most people did not change very much, but they built some beautiful cathedrals. Massive monuments to the power and the belief system of the elite. And next time you go to Europe, in fact, we've offered to go on accompany some university tours and take the people around cathedrals and explain the exploitation and oppression behind those. No university tours have taken us up on that yet, strangely. But that's what you're looking at. That to us is exactly the same symbol as you go to Egypt and look at the pyramids that were built 3,500 years before those cathedrals. You're looking at the same manifestation. Jeff.
Sorry, is that the direction of technological change, or is that just taking resources and spending them differently? You see what I'm asking?
Yes. So let me come on to that. Chat. So I think that and let me come to that when I come on to like how it went right, what went right, okay? Which was a lot about private sector initiative and decisions, a little bit about policy, but maybe not as much as you might think. So the second example of productivity bandwagon not delivering or taking a long time to deliver is in the early phase of the Industrial Revolution. Now, we can talk about when exactly the Industrial Revolution started. Different people have different start dates. But I think by 1780, the mechanization of cotton spinning was already underway. And that's really marks a fundamental difference in industrial technique and the organization of production, including the advent of large factories. So 1780, start the Industrial Revolution. If you look at the wage data and look at what people were receiving and look at real wages and real consumption, there were some episodes when things improved, including in the 1780s. But if you look at 1800, 1810, 1820, there's a long period in which people wages don't improve. And if you look at what happened to mechanization of cotton weaving, for example, which really took off after about 1810, there's a lot of weavers who didn't get new opportunities, who were actually still employed as weavers, but at much lower wages for decades. So from 1780 to well into the 1830s, perhaps 1840, there's very little improvement in real living standards of most workers in Manchester, in Newcastle, in other places that were the epicenter of real innovation and real productivity change. There were fortunes being made, but the fortunes were made by the people who owned the capital. So that's a big lag. That's a big eventually. You know, if we talk, when we start talking about AI in 20 minutes or so, and if I or you reach the conclusion that artificial intelligence and generative AI or whatever version you think is coming next is going to improve wages in 60 years, I think we might want to ask, can we do a little bit better than that? Now, I do think, yes.
Just to be clear, is the main story there that the average went up, but that the median didn't, that all the benefits went to a small group? Or was it that the average didn't go up that much because it didn't spread widely?
In terms of wages?
The productivity, so did the output per person go up a lot, but it was concentrated in a small number of people so that the typical person didn't benefit? Or did the output per person not go up that much because the technology was not widespread? Like, which of those two is closer to?
Yeah, okay. So it's a combination of those two. It's a combination of those two. So we in the industries where productivity change, where there was innovation in the cotton industry and in adjacent textiles, there were definitely productivity improvements, and there were substantial productivity improvements. In cotton spinning and then the power loom, when that was well organized and well financed, for example, in the 1820s, those were several orders of magnitude more productive than the systems that existed before. So, but that was a relatively small part of the economy, right? And our view of when these things start to go right, there are two versions of this, and we go into this in great detail in the book. I mean, one part of it, one story tell through a British lens or an English lens, and that's one which begins with the railways, which expanded a lot of new tasks for which you needed expertise, and you were conferring responsibility on workers. So they weren't working under your direct supervision in a factory. They were dispersed around running signals, running expensive engines, and you paid them for their expertise. So that's when that begins to change. New tasks, paying people for expertise, but also the rise of countervailing power. So the rise of trade unions in Britain, which were demanding better working conditions and a share in the productivity gains, right, Eric? And also demanding that working conditions for children, for example, be regulated. So, I mean, there's a further example of how long it took for the Industrial Revolution to be shared. I mean, it's well documented that in the 1840s, there were children as young as 6 working deep underground for 12 hours a day, pushing, coal carts with their head, right? So that's a long delay. You have a political reaction to that. That's the countervailing power of trade unions. But of course, you also have democratization. You also have the Chartists. You have a push for towards one person, one vote, away from the idea of a property-based franchise. And it's that combination that really helps to deliver in the British context higher wages, more widely spread. So it's a combination of the technology creating new tasks. Come back to that, and social pushback, trade unions. And organization and the political change that made the trade unions possible. Because initially, all efforts to organize trade unions in the 1810s or 1820s were crushed politically. But the American story, which you can also, I think, is also helpful and maybe well, just as relevant for what comes next, is that the American system of manufactures, which developed really after 1850. So in the Great Exhibition of 1851 in England, Crystal Palace, there was almost no American industry exhibited there. By 1890, the US was the leading industrial power in the world. And of course, what the key characteristic of American industry in the North was that there was relatively a lot of unskilled or not very educated labor. And the people who built these factories and these enterprises made very good use of people who didn't have a lot of formal education and made them more productive, right? Including with new tasks. So we would emphasize, Eric, and for the economists in the room in particular, the importance of boosting marginal productivity rather than just average productivity. So the marginal productivity in these enterprises was higher. And that, of course, so you have the new tasks being created, you have higher marginal productivity, you have some rise of countervailing power, more perhaps at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And of course, you have a lot of demand for more political representation, including through the progressives. Our favorite example, and I obviously have to use Henry Ford carefully. Some of Henry Ford's attitudes are very non-modern, and some of them are actually reprehensible. But Henry Ford, when he came to Detroit at the beginning of the 20th century, Detroit made 2,500 cars in 1899, right before Ford showed up. Henry Ford did two things. He automated, he put car production onto a production line, a moving line, and perhaps even more consequential, brought electricity to the production line. So you move from a belt and shaft system to a system where you had decentralized sources of power through electricity in the factory. This was a huge transformation. Automation, right, which we're grappling with, which is the cornerstone of Henry Ford replaced people with machines, without question. Big increase in productivity, but he also created a huge number of additional tasks. So by the end of the 1920s, both GM and Ford were making 1.5 million cars each, and the car industry employed 400,000 people. A lot of them had good wages. A lot of these tasks had that expertise, and of course we had plenty of political debate and argument, including at the time of Herbert Hoover, and right after about what are the rights of the workers, to what extent can you be unionized, and to what extent how does that impact the political system? The 1950s, 60s, and 70s, which were not perfect and not everybody participated, but if you look back at the way in which productivity increased, technology changed, productivity increased, and the benefits that were shared through higher wages, it's pretty impressive. And arguably, certainly as a 30-year period, rather unusual in any history. And that was true for the United States. That's true for a lot of European countries too. I think you need to use the microphone.
Thank you. We saw both those effects I asked about. One, we saw more productivity growth that raised the overall or the average, but also there was a redistribution where lower wage people got a proportional gains. So both those effects combined to help off the bottom half of workers.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's fair to say that if we'd written this book in 1980, well, personally, it wouldn't have occurred to us because I think what we should have said was this is a solved problem. That the humans have always been inventive and creative. We've always been coming up with new tools, new ways of organizing ourselves. For thousands of years, we were trapped in these sort of agricultural empires where the people with the ideas did not get to rise up. You didn't create a middle class. You were expropriated by the elite. Different versions of that. But with the Industrial Revolution, we broke free from those forms of social organization. It took a while to put the productivity gains together with enough political rights and enough countervailing power, so the companies could innovate, but they felt they had to share with the workers, and they created a lot of new tasks. In 1980, I think we should have said, "Hey, problem solved. This is just amazing. This is what humans have struggled with for 10,000, 50,000 years. It has been solved. We know how to do this, and you can do it in other places." I think, though, today that's not what we're saying, because 40 years later, that's not what we've seen. So we've continued to see productivity increases. Perhaps they've slowed down, so that's an interesting thing to explore. We've not seen the gains at the low end. In fact, as I'm sure you're all aware, the wage dispersion has increased a great deal. And if you look at the wages for men at the lower end, they've actually declined in real terms by some measures since the 1980s. Women have gone up, but women with less education has not gone up as much as for women with higher education. And our countervailing powers have disintegrated, right? The trade union movement has dissipated for various reasons. And our political system has become, well, there's obviously a wide range. I can see a wide range of perspectives in this room, but the political system has become less adept at dealing with this issue, or less focused on the sharing of prosperity in this way. So I think it's fair to say, in the category of, should we redirect technology? So we could also say, look, let's just do this through redistribution. Let technology do its thing, the market does its magic, and then we redistribute. And that is a standard economic approach, absolutely. A lot of 200 years of thinking on that. The problem is that redistribution seems pretty after 40 years of this experience, redistribution seems like it's not enough. It's not redress this balance. It's not address the social and economic causes of and drivers of polarization in this country and in other countries. So if we could redirect technological change, what would that look like? What would it mean, right? So this is the will we change, will we redirect technology, which I think is the big interesting question. And it is, I think, what you work on also, Eric. But let me try to frame it this way. So artificial intelligence, what is artificial intelligence? How should we think about what artificial intelligence, as we currently understand it, offers? Is it something that is going to reinforce what we've seen in the digital age? Okay, I know I'm in the William Gates building. I'll speak very carefully about that. I think there were a lot of, let's call them unintended consequences of digitization. It definitely contributed, in retrospect, to some of this wage polarization. Are we going to get more of that? Or could artificial intelligence be something different? Could it be something that actually raises productivity and empowers people lower down the income scale? So our argument in the book is, it depends on which way we decide to go, which way you decide to go. This is absolute. There's nothing that we can see in the history of technology that is like, oh, it's preordained. You have to go this direction. So our read of technology is it's shaped by people who have vision. It's shaped by people who have power. It's shaped by what people like you today are trying to create around you. And it does seem to us, with all due respect to computer science, and this is something Eric has also written about, that there is a strong tradition in computer science that has focused on replicating human abilities. The Turing trap, Eric has called it, I think is a very good name for it, which is thinking, okay, this is what humans can do. Can I make a machine that can play chess, play Go, or check people out of the grocery store as well as a human, or almost as well as a human, right? In contrast, the alternative, which we also see in some of Eric's work, one of his recent papers, is other ways to use AI to complement humans. Now, obviously, all technology complements some humans. I understand that, right? If you read Kurt Vonnegut's Play a Piano, written, I think, in 1947, a brilliant, well, I think by far one of the most insightful visions of the world we live in, or predictions of the world we live in today. There's a few people who run the machines, the engineers, and everyone else is doing make work, or you could call it universal basic income with some, with some labor attached. So obviously, all machines complement someone. What we're talking about is there a path for artificial intelligence that will complement people with less formal skill? Or David Autor, Daron and I run a small group at MIT called Shaping the Future of Work. And David's terminology, I think, is very good, is can you help people people without a lot of formal education, become more expert and be compensated for that expertise, right? So why are we paid more money than our subsistence level? And why will that be the experience for, I'm sure, absolutely all of you in your careers and everybody who's watching this this live stream? That's because you build expertise that is hard for your employer to replicate, to find an alternative. You're specialized in a way that's useful and productive to whoever's running the enterprise or to the economy. So can we build an AI that does that? Now, I'm happy, we'd be delighted to be wrong about the following assessment, which is our read of both computer science, big tech companies, and honestly, a lot of companies that use technology, is that that's not the path they're on. So I had a conversation with some, let's say, companies in the financial sector last week about this. And I said, I talked about these two pathways, and they're like, well, that's very interesting, Simon. But first of all, it's not our job to create jobs. Our job is to remunerate shareholders, right? Broadly speaking, that's true. And the jobs that and also, we're not focused on firing people. That's not what we're about. This is what they said to me. They said, but you have to understand from a compliance point of view and from a consistency of business operations in our global business, because this is a global digital technology, right? That's available everywhere all at once. We are finding that it's just much better to use versions of AI to control our processes. And the jobs that we eliminate are what we call the cut and paste jobs. So cut and paste job would be a white collar, as I understand it, a white collar job with a fair amount of repetition in it. You're doing something over and over again. It's not something that was easy to automate with our previous non-AI automation, right? So that's why it stayed with the humans. But now these are the jobs that appear to be most vulnerable. And another one of my colleagues who hasn't yet published his results, so I won't tell you her name, who's looked in great detail at what's happening to the kinds of jobs people are advertising, the kind of jobs people say that they're qualified to get, and how these are coming together. Her feeling is it's not the bottom, let's say 20-25% of the labor force that's being let go or fired. It's the people immediately above that. And if you think about the work that David Autor and others have done on earlier, that period from 1980 to today, it's exactly saying it's the middle, what previous generations of automation and some globalization, although honestly, a lot of globalization was made possible by technological change in telecommunications and in shipping. That combination reduced opportunity for people in the middle of the income, of the education scale and the income scale, which pushed them down, if you think rungs of the labor market, pushed them down to the lower end to compete with people who had less education and less skill than them. And that's the hollowing out effect. That's the polarization effect that David Autor and Daron have written about extensively. So I think this is what I want to talk about with you guys. This is why I'm here. This is why it's a thrill to be at Stanford, because you are absolutely in. Okay, MIT is important too. Don't get me wrong, particularly as they may be watching. But you are at the center of inventing this future and of thinking about, okay, what do you want AI to do? Which way could it go? And you know, we have some policy ideas. Honestly, and I've been involved in policy for 20 years. I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. You know, these policy ideas are a heavy lift because this is not a highly regulated industry. If you say you want to regulate the tech sector in Washington, D.C., someone at the back of the room, a senior staffer, usually says, China, behind their hand like that. Oh, we couldn't possibly regulate tech sector, right? And so I don't think there's going to be a lot of regulation here. I think the dynamic of private business, which sometimes is very good, right? That dynamic that redirected technological change and that spread the Americans manufacturing around the world in the 1870s, 1890s, that was mostly private sector. Right? Henry Ford was not doing what he did because the government told him to do it. That was the private sector logic. So what's the private sector logic today? You know, and honestly, I know the Hoover Institution is somewhere around here, so I tread carefully. Milton Friedman said the business of business is business. I get that logic. But the logic of that is also, if my business is business and you are running the government and you're up for re-election and you're the regulator who's, you know, I can go in and persuade, well, I think, you know, the logic of business is going to pull me into the political sphere and I'm going to want to change the rules in my favor. So look, there's a policy ask here. There's a private sector ask. I don't see that as being compelling. So there's a social ask. There's who are we? Who are we at universities? Who are we as scientists and as social scientists? What do we believe in? Where does this vision come from? Is the vision that's going to shape this technology the vision of incumbents, the vision of a few billionaires, or is it a broader, more widely shared vision? Are there lessons that we can learn from these previous technological transformations? That's the question that I would put to you today. Thank you, Eric.
Well, those are a great set of questions. Thank you so much for that presentation. So let's open up for questions. I have a question to start things off, and I'm sure others will as well. I definitely want to talk about AI and the implications of all that. But let me just take a step back. And when you're talking about directing technical change and some of the things that happened in the 20th century and that worked out well and earlier not so well, there's and I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what you're saying, but there's an alternative view, and let me sort of steelman it, which is that, sure, we want not just prosperity, but shared prosperity, but free markets have been much better at doing that. And that when the central planning or government tries to direct technical change, it often ends up doing more harm than good. That ultimately there are, it's not you in charge of the government. It's a group of other people who have their own sorts of interests that may or may not align with the rest of the people. And if you look at the 20th century, central planning systems didn't necessarily do so well in some of those right. decisions. So how would you address the concerns that if we want that kind of shared prosperity, giving more power to the government isn't necessarily a path to it?
Yeah, look, we're obviously, well, I should have said, we're not in favor of central planning, and we're pretty hard on central planning in the book, okay? And I do agree that markets can and have brought a lot of positive changes, including when the market incentives and the market motivation is to create jobs that have, like I said, you build expertise at the lower end, you pay people wages, and they can go work for somebody else. So you've got to, pay them a higher wage than you did previously. I think, though, and prior to 1940, Eric, of course, the predominant idea in American government and in American science, by the way, was not to have the federal government involved in supporting science. In fact, most of the scientists, to the extent we can understand their views in the 1930s, leading scientists and engineers did not want federal government money because it came with strings attached. And so that was why Vannevar Bush going to see President Roosevelt in June of 1940 and saying, hey, we should redeploy science to this coming war. Obviously, they weren't at war yet, and figure out how to match our potential enemies in terms of technology. That was a very big moment and a huge intellectual shift. And Bush then had to persuade lots of other people. Well, okay, he had to persuade the head of MIT and Harvard. That was about it. But once you've done that, and I guess the physicists at Berkeley. So it is. I think it is very legitimate and appropriate to say, how much do you want government to do here? We do have the federal government's put significant money into science, and as I said, we argued for more of that. And you can certainly see experiences. The Human Genome Project would be one that was turned down by private venture capital, but turned out to be a pretty robust and very successful industry that we were able to build. You can see a lot of some of the effort in COVID vaccines, for example, that I think really stand out. And of course, clean energy. So the cost of renewables, including wind power and solar power, has come down dramatically, in part because of the subsidies and encouragement for R&D in that space. So federal government can do it. Now, is there an agenda within what we're talking about, the sort of human complementary versus human substituting? That is at a very early stage, and we need you to write more papers, Eric, so we can measure the damn thing, right? And think about what works and what doesn't. I said that it's an uphill climb, and we don't have, we're looking for policies and we're looking for traction there. If the private sector can do it by itself, great. But I do also think that, what's upstream of even markets, Eric, is vision, right? What are you trying to build? What do technologists believe in? What do you think is important? And that is why we're trying to shift away from just, the traditional economist thing about redistribution and say, okay, where do we get these ideas? Where do we get these building blocks of the economy and these opportunities? I think it's from people like people in this room and who are watching online.
Okay, well, we could say more, but I want to give a chance here to let's go with Chad.
Great, thanks. That was really interesting.
Why don't we have everybody introduce themselves when they speak, just so everybody knows?
Chad Jones from the Business School at GSB. I had two questions. One is, what do you see as the externalities that are, if you wrote down a model, what would be the things that are making us get it wrong? I think it'd be helpful to think about things that way. And then the other one is sort of a question, I guess it's been around a long time. Maybe the Oppenheimer movie brought it out as well, that if it can be done, it will be done. And so one view is, if you look at the past, yeah, we followed these certain tracks because that's how the technological landscape was. And so I was wondering what your best examples of things that we could have done but didn't do and should have done might be. By the way, I think an alternative view, maybe this is your answer, is that the world's combinatoric. There are a bazillion things we could try, and we're following one path, and it's not necessarily the right path. And the space program is a great example because, absent wars, maybe we wouldn't have followed the same path with rockets in World War II and the space program. But I just want to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think when HIV/AIDS first came on the scene or appeared and began to be understood, I remember this is in the 1980s. I remember AIDS activists demanding more federal money for R&D on the disease, and my reaction was, why? Why is that what you're asked, right, as opposed to something else? And in retrospect, I think that was the most brilliant, insightful thing they could have asked for, because what that required, of course, was a reshaping of the vision, right? And they had a big fight, if you remember, with the Reagan administration initially about what was the nature of this disease and whose disease was, and so on and so forth. But putting money in, and obviously they didn't find a cure, but they did find treatments, and those treatments have become better over time. And I think that was a well-defined, and we obviously have, health is a little bit different from broader economic things, right? Because we can define problems, and we might worry about sometimes unintended spillover consequences, but you can define the problem, and then apply money to it and apply science to it. But I think that, Chad, to me is, I don't know things we didn't do, but I can see things that we did that we wouldn't have done without the pressure. And the HIV/AIDS activism is one. And I think the renewable energy, the money that went into renewable energies and driving down those cost curves, which of course that's private sector innovation encouraged by subsidies, yeah, and some slightly weird competition from China. I understand that. But I think that that's when you talk to people about clean energy around the world and you imagine what the future could be like, that's actually changed everything, right? And now maybe the cost curves would have come down anyway because we'd get to scale, but would they have come down as fast? I don't think so. So I think that we have a lot of choices, and if we can define the choices and articulate them, either the private sector can take them on, right? If Eric in his studies show people, if you do it this way, you get this versus that way, well, that's a very interesting choice. A lot of management are very open to that today. Maybe in the past they were less open. But also if you can say, look, we obviously tax, when you think about, should I hire a worker or should I buy a machine, an algorithm, or rent it? There's a higher tax on the worker than there is on the machine. Now, we're not favoring, unlike some people, we're not favoring taxing machines. And we're not also advocates of universal basic income because we think people want to work and we think work brings respect, and the politics of UBI I don't think would be sustainable. But can we find ways to balance out the tax system? Can we find ways to build, the DARPA accelerates the development of self-driving cars with, a funny little competition, drive $1 million to have a self-driving car run around the desert, which is not a very useful thing initially, but that was a real catalyst, I think. Now, would it have happened anyway? Maybe. Did they accelerate it? I think absolutely, and they brought a lot of attention there. So why is the DARPA type of initiative for human complementary technology? Maybe it's in Eric's lab, maybe it's in the GSB, maybe it's at MIT. I think looking for those sparks, it's not like, I don't think technology is this juggernaut that you just can't change. I think there are many, many paths, and we choose them without even thinking about them. And I think that we should, at least with what we know now, we should be a little more cognizant, a little more thinking ahead about that.
Pete?
Yeah, Pete Clino in economics. So one thing that's maybe a little more destructive and then more constructive question. The destructive one is, it strikes me a little bit weird, academics saying to the industry, here's our vision, we think this might be useful to you. It reminds me of like kind of wishful thinking of people telling farmers, oh, it's actually more profitable to be organic. Well, either it is or it isn't, and the informational spread. So I'm always a little bit skeptical of people not doing that for a living, telling people to do it for a living. Okay, the more constructive thing is, and you started to touch on it. Is there something like, like I think about the green R&D subsidies versus a carbon tax. Like I heard Sam Cordham say, what's green R&D? That seems really hard, but a carbon tax is relatively easy. Is there a similar thing here where it's going to be hard to identify and subsidize labor complementing research, but it's going to be easy to tax machines? So why not?
Yeah, so we're not in favor of taxing machines. Let's be clear about that. And I think we wrote the book in part to clarify our own thinking and also to link it up with policy. And I think there are certain knee-jerk things, and there's some very powerful people who are saying you should tax machines. And I think that we're not opposed to automation. We're not opposed to replacing people with machines. We think that a lot of times, and this is, John's done quite a work on this with Pascal Restrepo, for example, you see, and Eric's also talked about this, the sort of the social automation where people bring in machines to replace people, and it's not that much more productive. They do it because they're, the machines are more compliant, it may be fashionable, analysts like it, whatever. So, but we're not trying to stop people from adopting machines and algorithms. Absolutely not. We're trying to say, let's use them in a certain way. But I don't yet have the levers for that. I mean, that's it's at an early stage. Okay, just like if we talked about climate change in the 1980s, I haven't been back to chat, but I don't think people were articulating the exact levers that developed. I think you have to go through you have to have this kind of discussion. You've got to go through a political process. You see what works. I mean, the thing with the book with Gruber, we thought that was like a 10 or 20-year ask, and it just happened that COVID came along and reminded people that science has these unexpected. There's a tail on the positive side for scientific investment that you don't often think about, and all of a sudden you have a crisis and you do. So we'll see where events take us. On the destructive comment, I don't think that's destructive at all, because in the book we actually root what we're saying in the history of computer science and the people who built that industry. And of course, a lot of them had a different conception at the beginning, the hacker culture, and there are people who still advocate for some of those perspectives. So we're actually there's a dominant, our view is there's a dominant view in computer science or a dominant view in the commercial end of it, and then there's this less dominant view. They used to be much more equal, and the dominant view just had a lot of commercial logic to it at this particular moment. But it seems to us that this human complementary element, which what we talk about, human augmentation, element could be pretty attractive if people find the right applications for it. So I understand an economist telling people this is a sort of application of the central planning. Do you really want the economist to be in charge? Probably not. But helping people understand or think about and argue about ways in which the history of technology and technologists have thought about this, I think that's perfectly legitimate.
And one partial answer to both Chad and Pete in terms of what the externality is. I mean, in agriculture, I think there's a big investment in hybrid corn research that the farmers didn't do on their own. But I'm not an expert on this, but I think Zvigorlikas, showed that there's a lot of R&D that went into it from the central government that did change the direction of technology adoption in that industry, and they continue to do all sorts of stuff on different kinds of fertilizers, et cetera. Right? That's a market failure. Yes.
No. I agree with that. I think the case for subsidizing basic research is pretty well established, and that one I think makes
that's good
because
because we cited your work, Chad, in the previous book saying that. So I'm glad
exactly. So that I'm totally on board with. It's more picking the direction. I kind of want more examples of where you might pick the direction and it works, or you can look back and say we should have picked a different direction. Or
all right. So the example I use often, but it's Eric's work, so I'm kind of nervous about using it here, is that Eric has this very nice paper, still working paper, which shows what happens if you in customer service if you use certain kind of AI.
Yes, Lindsay, Raymond, Daniel Lee.
Thank you. I just say it's
Your MIT
I just say it's Eric's paper. I know it's a terrible habit. What's really intriguing, so I don't know about your view of customer service, automated customer service and chatbots. I mean, I think it's absolutely horrible. The idea, though, what Eric and his colleagues seem to find is that if you put the humans together with generative AI of a certain kind that's using the knowledge, particularly the knowledge of the firm, and particularly for repeated problems that people have seen many times, that's very helpful to humans who are less experienced and less, I don't know if it's less educated, but certainly less experienced as customer service people.
Both less experienced and less skilled. They both did better.
Right. So you can raise the productivity, the ability of those people lower down the experience and education scale by helping them using the machine to help them solve problems. But you need the human, because when you see when a problem comes that is not in the routines that the companies encountered before, the AI is useless. You will need to have the human.
So you can do it, but I think part of Chad's question is why would you specifically advocate for that technology policy versus a different one? I mean, let me give you an answer I sometimes give, and maybe you want to cope. It's part of what you're saying as well. Is that we may have a preference for more widely shared prosperity, less inequality, and so that even if you have the same private returns, if one of the outcomes led to a more equal outcome versus a less equal outcome, we may decide that we
yeah, look, I think what we're dancing around here, because it's an economics talk, and a technology talk, is polarization, right? So I'm not opposed to inequality, and I think some inequality is unavoidable in any kind of market economy, and I favor market economies. But I think when you get extreme polarization, when you have a hollowing out at the center, and when you have a disconnection of many people from the productivity process, from the scientific innovation. I mean, the biggest pushback we got on the science thing, Chad, initially, again, COVID changed this, was people said, oh, yeah, great, more money for California and Massachusetts. Why is that a good idea, right? And so we spent a lot of time explaining why that wasn't the proposal and why that wasn't what you would get. And I don't think that's what the policy is attempting to pursue in geographic terms as well as in socioeconomic terms. But there is a I think that while I understand full well there's a lot of rhetoric in this space and a lot of distraction, I think that people who in that post-war period were quite connected to productivity enhancements and technological improvements, the people who are sort of their descendants, or people who are sociologically descended from them, the people in the middle don't feel that the middle of America, the middle of the wage scale, the middle of education, do not feel that connected, and with good reason, right? And I think a big part of it is the way in which technology has unfolded. And so, this is not particularly saying anybody's to blame. Also, it's saying that's the way that the market took us in this episode. In the 1870s and 90s, took us a different way. So, can we redress that? Is there a way to get at that? I think we're at an early stage of answering that question. But is the right question.
And as you said early on, there is an alternative approach, which is you make the pie as big as possible, get the market roll, and then you have redistribution. You have basic income or other things, and actually, yeah, and you're jumpstarting America. It might be then you give more money to Stanford and MIT, and then all the great innovations that we invent, we then take that money and send some of it to Alabama. And I think what you're arguing in the earlier book and in this book is that some people call it pre-distribution, but you're changing the mechanism so you don't wait till afterwards and then redistribute, but you try to have them the different parties create the benefits more in a more distributed way from the beginning.
Yeah, in the previous book, in Jumpstart America, we tried actually to stay away from anything that could trigger people in a partisan sense. So we talked very little about clean energy here because we knew we'd lose some votes on that. And we basically said, look, go for more spillover. Science has become more expensive. Innovation more expensive. That's one of Chad's findings. So put a lot more money in, go for the big breakthroughs, swing for the fences, and spread it around the country. Because
but explain what's wrong with the other approach of just making the pie as big as possible.
Yeah.
If the marginal product of R&D is better at MIT or Stanford, or if the technology creates more value by automating people, let that happen. And then later write checks to people who didn't gain.
Yeah. So I think a couple of concerns about it. First of all, if you get the big productivity gains, then I think that is feasible. If you don't get the big productivity gains, it's harder to afford that. I think also politically, so this, okay, I understand they didn't reference our book in the legislation. I get how that works. I like to say that the success in Washington is when you sit down at lunch with somebody and the person says to you, Simon, what we should really do as our top national priority is, and then they say the idea that you've been putting out there, and they have no idea they got it from you. In which case, the right response is, wow, what a great idea. Yes, I'm fully on board your team. So anyway, this versions of this idea got 64 votes in the Senate, right? Because enough people bought into the idea that it would raise up Alabama and Texas and the Midwest, New York, obviously, upstate New York, very important, as well as on the east and west coast. And that's actually, so I think that and we did some follow-up work with Enrico Moretti on this, Jon Gruber and I did. And I think where we end up with that is that, yes, there are bigger productivity gains to be expected because you have stronger clusters of science in certain places. I mean, the one place that did strike us, and we were doing this work before COVID and before all the work from home stuff, but San Francisco did strike us as being rather expensive, offsetting the benefits of the strong cluster. But I think politically, Eric, that a lot of places, even if there's a bit of an edge on the east and west coast, and you're going to get more money, including from your corporate friends, right? So we're not depriving those coasts, but the politics of making that more accessible, and including now after COVID, where we think differently about distance and where we need to be in different parts of the work week or work year, I think that is that's a much stronger political argument. And you do want to think about the sustainability of financing for any of this stuff.
So I'd like to go online and also bring it more to AI and data. So there's a question from Burton Martins, and he says, AI puts a premium on large data pools compared to fragmented data sets. Will it expropriate value from small firms and individuals? And so this is a question of this centralization and decentralization at the firm level. And there is, obviously there are some really big players who are pushing the frontier there, perhaps in large part because they have much larger data sets.
Yeah, it does seem that the increasing returns to scale, like get more data and use that to train the models, that seems to be the dominant economic logic here. And it does seem like there's two ecosystems, the Microsoft one and the Google one, that have big advantages compared to anybody else. So, I mean, that is our read of the industrial logic. And then the question is, what's the vision of those companies? What are their priorities? So again, the book is open to them. We know people in those organizations. I would say that it's full speed ahead on automation from their perspective. That the human replication is the dominant thing.
Stipulating, let's suppose that that's the case, that there's this payoff to these much bigger data sets. Is there a policy implication from either of your books about trying to lean against that, or what?
I do think protection of intellectual property is a legitimate, important part of our economy. And I would remind everyone that the characteristic of previous technological transformations, including the one that strikes me, is that the modernization of British English and British agriculture in the 1700s and the early 1800s, things that were previously common property and did not have a market value were privatized, meaning they turned into private property.
Enclosures Act.
And all of the Enclosures Act did exactly this. So that land became valuable. Some kinds of land became valuable in ways that hadn't been valuable before. People had used it, but it didn't have a market value. And so this marketization, which advocates at the time said we need this in order to modernize. But Arthur Young, who was the leading proponent of this policy in the 1780s, by the early 1800s, he was saying, why have we taken poor people here that Parliament says we respect property and it's all about the power of property, but I had a cow that I was grazing on common land. I don't have a cow anymore, right? So you were driving people down into poverty. And I think that kind of expropriation has often come as the technology changes what's valued. So data that we were giving away for free or sharing or whatever, we never thought it had value, now turns out to be valuable. So one question is, how much value would you get? But the second question is your data being used for purposes that you would regard as inappropriate, you don't agree to? We have some very compelling, by the way, I have a number of books to give away here. And the Stanford bookstore promises they'll get more. If you stole one of the 2 books they're missing, please return it immediately after this so somebody can buy it. Anyway.
Now you're for property rights.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have some very nice photographs, historical photographs of technology in the book, for which I paid a lot of money, right? Because we bought the rights. Those photographs, according to the people who own the photographs, like the agencies who own them, have been used to train AI for generation of images without compensating the agencies. So I think that's going to be a very interesting legal fight, and I think they should. I had to pay. They should pay.
That's a really interesting analogy to what happened with the Enclosures Act, and it'd be interesting, is that fleshed out more in some of your writing? The analogy there, it'd be great to.
I think it's mentioned, but maybe I should do a follow-up on for the inspiration.
Other questions or comments? We just have a couple of minutes. Okay, Jose Ramon. Yeah.
Jose Ramon Enriquez, postdoc here at the Digital Economy Lab and the GSB. So sometimes technologies are developed for certain purposes. You started to talking about military technology, but then that technology evolves to other purposes, more straightforward for social good. And I'm thinking, for instance, the GPS or the internet. However, as we expand the gap between ordinary citizens and whoever they develop that technology, it is unclear how the citizens will know about the harm that technology can produce. So how to alleviate this tension and how citizens will be able to know about this harm while the elites have some incentives to be more obscure about their interests or the potential harm of those technologies. And especially given that the economy is even more and more globalized, who is that society that it's going to have the countervailing?
Well, okay. So two responses there. First of all, answering the first question, this is why we have you, so you can explain to people what the good and bad side of technology. So thank you very much for that. I mean, I do think that civil society needs people who understand technology, who are not intimidated by technology, and who can explain it in terms that people can understand more broadly. And that's a very critical role that we had some of that if I look back in the early 20th century, I can see, accounts of industrial technology, and I can see, some of that fitting into the progressive movement, for example. But now is a tremendously important moment to have that, because there are certainly plenty of people who are less keen on revealing or discussing the potential negative consequences. I do think, though, when you mention globalized, I mean, one thing that is not, it's in the book, but the book is 500 pages, and it's a topic worth its own book, which is, what about outside the United States? Because one thing that's really striking about, obviously, digital technology, but including generative AI, I had discussions in January with people from Indonesia, civil society group from Indonesia, that were just as sophisticated in understanding about AI and what it could do as any discussion I had with MIT students or faculty at the same time. So I think this is a technology that's available everywhere, and it's a technology that impacts jobs everywhere, because it's not clear to me, I mean, there are jobs in other countries where your role is to do a rough draft in English of some document for marketing or other purposes that's then polished by a native speaker or somebody who's close to a native speaker. You don't need that rough first draft from a person anymore, because the machine can do that just as well. So I think there's an impact on jobs everywhere, and there's an issue of appropriate and inappropriate technology, if you've thought about that literature. If not, I'm sure Eric can fill you in. But this might be the mother of all inappropriate technologies, highly capital-intensive technology becoming available everywhere. There are self-checkout kiosks, I'm told, and self-checkout at parking lots in Kenya. Now, Kenya has some, I'm not saying it's a technological and sophisticated place. It's not a high-income place, right? So I'm I think outside the US, people are going to be really struggling with this much more. I think in the US, we'll have a robust discussion. We'll go back and forth, kinds of things we're talking about here. And you can have, I mean, the problem or the issue is this is not an industry that is easy to regulate, and there's not a strong regulatory history here. And when the industry says, please regulate us, they're just kidding. You know that, right? I mean, that's just a rhetorical device. So I don't think we'll get a lot of regulation, but there will be, stuff will happen, and we'll respond to scandals or accidents or things that are extreme and unacceptable. And I do think we'll have much stronger safeguards on surveillance in this society and in some Western societies than, for example, in China. If you look at on direction of technological change, it's quite well documented that Chinese federal government or national government and also state, provincial governments have been pushing aggressively for more use of AI in surveillance, which is social surveillance as well as presumably workplace surveillance. And I think from what we can see, the results are quite impressive. Consequently, I would suggest that the cost of being authoritarian anywhere in the world is coming down because this technology is going to be made available. You can buy it or be given it by China. Our book is going to be published in 20 languages around the world, but it will not appear in mainland China because we were approached by a couple of publishers who said, love the book, want to publish it, just need to make a few small cuts to satisfy the censor, and it's like half the book. So forget that. I think the world is going to split into a high surveillance and a surveillance safeguarded play. I mean, I don't know if it's 50-50 split. I think there's going to be a lot of countries in the authoritarian split. And then the question is going to be, how much do you want to trade with people whose competitive advantage is really squeezing workers? And so we're keeping society oppressed using technology that we have deliberately and for good reasons said no to. That's going to be a very interesting conversation.
Well, speaking of China, there's a question here from Philip Laleyville, and this will probably have to be the last question. Who you said you're against central planning, but he said, well, why wouldn't you want that with input from humanists and tech experts that could counter China's version of centrally planned direction?
Well, I think the problem with central planning is what you articulated earlier, Eric, that, assuming that you can put a few people in charge and we can imagine everything, and, the economy is too big and there's too much diversity and too much varied decisions. No, I think you want to have a market. But the question is, what's the vision behind that market? I mean, the vision behind the market when it developed in the 18th century, in the British version, was a very harsh version. I mean, the statement that most represents, I think, the view of the people who ran the British economy in the 18th and early 19th century was actually expressed by General Ireton in the Putney debates, which were 1647, as the English Civil War was concluding. He said, basically, if you don't own property, you don't have any stake in this country. The country is for people, and the country is organized around property. And I think in the 18th century was known as the Whig supremacy, which the Whigs were the people who wanted constraints on royal power, which they got after the Revolution of 1688, in order to protect what? Property. And for them, the biggest shock and horror was the French Revolution, a little bit the alignment, but particularly the French Revolution, because the French Revolution was about the rights of individual people. And for the British elite, it's like, no, we're not going to go there. That was a big part of the fight and a big part of why it took the British a long time to expand the franchise. So I think that, and they changed the views of the market and the views of what you can deliver with the market and the views of how people should live. I mean, my favorite technologist of all time, and I'm sure an absolute household name in every one of your households, is Edwin Chadwick. Right? No one's heard of Chadwick. I can see that. So Chadwick said in the 18th, Chadwick was a Benthamite. The Benthamites were not into, let's be good, let's be nice, let's do good because it's nice. No, Chadwick said, you know what? The country is undermined by the fact a lot of people are sick and we have all this infectious disease and the cities smell really bad, it was absolutely awful. Because there was no modern sanitation system. Chadwick said, why don't we bring running water into everybody's house for cleaning and cooking purposes and use that wastewater to flush out everything that needs to be flushed out through a sewer system and to process that waste and actually use the waste as an input into fertilizer. That was that was a ridiculous idea to people in the 1850s. That was a transformative idea. That's what made modern cities livable. That's what made our clusters of scientists possible, right? And that was not done out of altruism or because he cared particularly about poor people. He wanted to improve efficiency. But that reimagining of how we use technology and also repurposing existing technology and pulling technology towards making bigger, better sanitation That's a massive success. I mean, we call it a public investment now. We talk about spillovers, but it was a reimagining, a re-envisaging of what you could do with the market and what was the problem to be solved. And that was done by a Benthamite. So I think we can do at least as well as that today if we work on these problems further. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Simon. And the book is Power in Progress, also Jumpstarting America. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And next week, actually in 2 weeks, we have Ethan Mollick coming from Wharton, who's going to be talking about AI and worker productivity. So see you in a couple weeks.
Okay, cheers. Thank you. Did you get one, Pete?